Okay, good afternoon. Happy Hanukkah to you. And I get to bring home some latkes and donuts. And some honey too. Anyway, good afternoon. And this is contemporary for me. You're getting the first time out with this. I decided in the new year, I'm going to do a lot of more contemporary talks, like 1990 and 1991 and 1992, etc. So America's about ready to go to war in 1990. In Germany, there's a reunification of East and West Germany. That is me in St. Petersburg, Russia. And that's a subway station in St. Petersburg, Russia, and there's the hammer and sickle from the old USSR days. That subway system, that subway station in St. Petersburg also acts as a bomb shelter. Poland has a presidential election. Slovenia, they too want their independence. Yemen, there's a reunification of Yemen. Margaret Thatcher quits in England, and one of the biggest art heists ever takes place in Boston. And to this day, it has not been solved. And to this day, see, there's no painting in there. They kept the easels up, but there's no painting. They're still looking for those paintings 33 years later.
Wasn't there a big breakthrough just recently?
No, well, not really.
Not really?
Not really. I've been checking. Not really. They've had leads. The biggest upset in boxing history, well, Mike Tyson gets knocked out by Buster Douglas. I'm going to tell you a story because I was involved with this when I was covering the Major League Baseball owners, Major League Baseball players dispute. There was a lockout in 1990, and I got the commissioner of baseball to call me the Shadow. Who's the Shadow? Lamont Cranston, right? Well, he called me the Shadow because, what's the Shadow? Was Lamont Cranston know in the hearts of men, and there's evil that lurks in the hearts of men. I guess I was one of them. Oh, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was leaning too much in 1990. Almost fell over. And there I was about 10 years ago at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Everybody takes that picture. Everybody takes that picture when they're in Pisa. Home Alone was one of the big movies of 1990. Well, it was called Operation Desert Shield, and I'm sure every one of you remember Operation Desert Shield, General Schwarzenegger. Saddam Hussein in the United States has had a lot of problems with Saddam Hussein over the years, and Iraq. They decide to invade Kuwait. It's August. Saddam Hussein ordered the occupation of Kuwait in an attempt to gain control of lucrative oil supply of the Middle East and pay off a huge debt accrued from Kuwait. Saddam accused Kuwait of slant drilling or sucking oil from the Iraqi side. He used that charge as part of his justification for invading the emirate. Kuwait said, we never did that. We never did that at all. Wouldn't be us. Operation Desert Storm was the first foreign crisis for the United States after the unofficial end of the Cold War between the United States and the USSR in 1989. On August 2nd, one-time American ally, Saddam Hussein led a well-equipped Iraqi army into Kuwait, a major supplier of oil to the United States. Saddam allegedly repeatedly, violated the United Nations resolution, so the UN gave the United States support to invade Kuwait to kick out the Iraqis, but not 1990. And this is Operation Desert Shield, and they are getting set for action in 1991. President George Bush foreign policy team forged an international coalition consisting of NATO allies in the Middle East countries of Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Egypt to oppose Iraqi aggression. Soviet Union does not supply any troops, but it joins the United States in condemning Iraq, its longtime client state. So what about Israel? How does Israel play into this? Well, George W. Bush, or rather George H.W. Bush basically says, stay out. Stay out. Do not get involved. And it's up to the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, whether he's going to listen to Bush or not. Somehow, the United States, the Bush administration, was able to keep Israel out of the war. The Bush administration told Shamir that the United States Armed Forces would eliminate the danger of Scud attacks against Israel, while Israeli participation could well lead to the breakup of the coalition and ensuing difficulties. In other words, hey boys, take a couple Scuds. Take a couple Scuds. Don't fight back. We got your back, but take a couple Scuds. They'll be okay. They'll be okay. Should the U.S. not be successful in eliminating the Scud threat to Israel, the U.S. would acquiesce to an Israeli response. Like, trust us. Just trust us. We'll keep the bombs out of Israel. Iraq annexed Kuwait. The U.S.-led coalition of more than 24 nations began positioning more than 900,000 troops in the region, most of them stationed on the Saudi-Iraq border. And that's where we will leave it for 1990, going into what would be action in 1991. Bush has inherited a different world, or is now, well, he's actually now in his second year of presidency, and it's a totally different world than it was for Ronald Reagan in 1988. 2 years makes one hell of a difference, and here he is with Gorbachev. Cold War, supposedly over. George Bush supported Eastern European independence movements. U.S. policy would be reactive. Bush is not going to push anything. He's going to let events unfold organically, careful not to do anything to worsen the situation. Well, in Germany, the two Germanys actually are thinking about getting together. The Berlin Wall, which was put up in 1961, is down. Reagan asked Gorbachev to tear down that wall. Well, Reagan never did, but the wall would come down, separating West Berlin from East Berlin. That's 1961, when the start of the construction of the Berlin Wall took place. It started on August 13th. Construction of the wall was commenced by the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The wall cut off West Berlin from the surrounding East Berlin, including East Berlin. The barrier included guard towers placed along large concrete walls accompanied by a wide area that contained anti-vehicle trenches, beds of nails, and other defenses. Here they are. They are building the Berlin Wall. In 1955, the Soviets gave East Germany authority over civilian movement in Berlin, passing control to a regime not recognized in the West. East Germany was a Russian or USSR client state. East Germany granted visits to allow its residents access to West Germany to see family members. However, following the defection of large numbers of East Germans, the new East German state legally restricted virtually all travel to the West in 1956. And another picture of the wall, which separated families. Go ahead. With the closing of the East-West sector boundary in Berlin, the vast majority of East Germans can no longer travel or emigrate to West Berlin or West Germany. Many families were split. East Berliners employed in the West were cut off from their jobs. West Berlin became an isolated enclave in hostile land. West Berliners demonstrated against the wall, led by their mayor, Willy Brandt, who criticized the United States for failing to respond when the wall was built. But it didn't really stop people. Here's a guy who got through the wall and into West Germany. Almost 2 years after the Berlin Wall was erected, the President, John F. Kennedy, delivered one of his most famous addresses of his presidency to a crowd of about 120,000 people gathered outside West Berlin City Hall, steps from the Brandenburg Gate. Kennedy's speech has largely been remembered, this was in 1963, for one particular phrase: I am a Berliner. Well, before the Berlin Wall, this is how you escaped. You just ran to the other side. The Berlin Wall was not one wall. It was two walls. It was 155 kilometers, or 96 miles long, 4 meters or 13 feet tall. The walls were separated by a heavily guarded mine corridor of land known as the Death Strip. Now, if you tried to escape, the idea was, we're going to kill you. But at least 171 people tried and were killed, but it wasn't impossible to get over the wall. Escape from East Germany was not impossible. From 1961 till the wall came down, 5,000 East Germans, including 600 border guards, managed to cross the border by jumping out of windows adjacent to the wall, climbing over barbed wire, flying in hot air balloons. I'm taking a hot air balloon. When are you coming back? Oh, 1992. And crawling through sewers and driving through unfortified parts of the wall at high speed. So people were able to escape. Reagan to Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Tear down this wall. Reagan was not planning a visit to Berlin in 1987. He was going to be in Europe in early June 1987, visiting Rome, then spending several days in Venice for an economic summit. At the request of the West German government, his schedule was adjusted to permit him to stop in Berlin for a few hours on his way back to the United States from Italy. On June 12, 1987, Reagan gave a speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. The city was celebrating its 750th anniversary. World leaders were stopping by to help in the celebration. Reagan stood about 100 yards from the concrete barrier dividing East and West Germany and East and West Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Tear down this wall." Western pundits viewed it as a misguided idealism on Reagan's part, while the Soviet news agency TASS called it openly provocative and warmongering. Gorbachev wasn't impressed, he told an American audience years later. "Nah, we're not impressed. We knew Mr. Reagan's original profession was that of an actor." He was an actor reading lines initially. But the walls would come tumbling down, and they did. That would be in 1989. On November 9th, Gunter Schabkowski, a spokesman for East Berlin's Communist Party, announced a change in the city's relations with the West. Starting at midnight that day, he said citizens of East Germany were free to cross the country's borders. East and West Berliners flocked to the wall. Of course, they're drinking beer. Like, it's a celebration. It's celebration. They're drinking beer. They're drinking champagne and chanting, "Tor off! Open the gate!" At midnight, they flooded through the checkpoints. The next morning, they were at the mall, shopping. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to shop. Well, Germany reunification takes place in 1990. And that's a picture of the former East Germany. And basically says, no Nazis here. The Nazi Party is outlawed in Germany. You cannot be a Nazi from Germany. The peaceful revolution, part of the international revolutions of 1989, included a series of protests by East German citizens and led to the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, and East Germany's first free elections, March 18th, 1990. There were negotiations between the two countries that culminated in the Unification Treaty. Germany is reunification, or reunified, as you can see here. The United States, England, France, Soviet Union had occupied Germany since the end of World War II, and today is December 8th, and it was 82 years ago today that the United States declared war on Japan. It wasn't December 7th, it was December 8th. And on December 11th, 1941, Hitler, Germany, and Italy, Mussolini, declared war on the United States 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, honoring their treaty with Japan. So actually today is the day that America entered World War II 82 years ago. Well, East Germany was a Soviet client state. All four countries had to sign off on the unification. Now this is Hyde Park. This is the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library, and those are pieces of the Berlin Wall. They were cut into little shapes, and freedom it's a freedom statue, and it's part of the Berlin Wall, which is now in Hyde Park, New York. On June 13th, the East German border troops officially began dismantling the wall. There was a piece of the wall that used to be, I think it was 56th Street in between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue. There's a little alleyway where they had a piece of the wall. On July 1st, the day East Germany adopted the West German currency, all border controls ceased, although the inter-German border had become meaningless for some time before that. The complete demolition of the wall was in 1994. I've seen pieces of the wall in Washington, D.C. I've seen pieces of the wall in Seattle, Washington, behind the Space Needle, obviously in Hyde Park, and I told you where it was in New York City and Manhattan on 56th Street. The Parliament of East Germany passed a resolution on August 23rd declaring the accession of the German Democratic Republic to the Federal Republic of Germany and the extension of the field of application of the Federal Republic's basic law to the territory of East Germany as allowed by Article 23 of the West German Basic Law, effective October 3rd. The reunification. Oh, one of the things that you see in the former East Germany now, the Golden Arches, McDonald's. Hey, all those former communist countries, they got to eat too, right? They need some bad hamburgers, right? Well, there they go. So they get McDonald's. Hunger? Yeah, I think I'd stay hungry before I eat McDonald's. Conditions in East Europe and the Soviet Union were changing rapidly. Following the Soviet Union President Mikhail Gorbachev's decision to loosen the Soviet influence on the Warsaw Pact allies. The countries of Eastern Europe created an independent democratic momentum that led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the overthrow of communist rule throughout Eastern Europe. Let me ask you a question here. How many of you have families that came from Eastern Europe and all the countries? Where they come from? Poland, Russia, Austria. Well, I'm not going to talk about Austria, but I'm going to talk about those other countries. Soviet Union, March 14th, there's an election. There's Gorbachev. The Soviet Union presidential election was held on March 14th to elect a president for a 5-year term. The first presidential election ever to be held in the Soviet Union. The office of the president was established earlier that year. The election was uncontested with Mikhail Gorbachev, then General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the only candidate. On March 15th, the day after the election, at the meeting of the Congress of People's Deputies, Gorbachev becomes the president of the Soviet Union. On March 24th, 10 days after the election, President Gorbachev appoints his cabinet. But the Soviet Union is different, and that is Boris Yeltsin right there, and he becomes a powerful leader. Following the elections, Gorbachev faced conflicting internal political pressures. Boris Yeltsin and the pluralist movement advocated to become a democracy and rapid economic reforms, while the hard-line communist elite wanted to thwart Gorbachev's reform agenda. And this guy is becoming more and more powerful, the former mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin. On May 29th, the parliament of the Russian SFSR elected him the president of the Russian Republic against Gorbachev's wishes. In his new role, Yeltsin publicly supported the right of Soviet republics to greater autonomy within the Soviet Union, took steps to give the Russian Republic more autonomy, and declared himself in favor of a market-oriented, multi-party political system. In July, Yeltsin quits the Communist Party. And McDonald's opens in the Soviet Union. You might laugh at this. You might laugh totally at this. But the Soviets wanted McDonald's. They really, really did want McDonald's. Yeah, well, they thought of it, if we get McDonald's, we're moving up in the world. That's how they looked at it. The first McDonald's in the country had a grand opening on Moscow's Pushkin Square on January 31st, 38,000 people wanted a McDonald's hamburger. 38,000 people wanted a McDonald's hamburger. They waited in long lines for hours. They broke company records at the time. I wonder if they wanted 2 all-beef patties with everything else thrown on as well. McDonald's. I haven't had McDonald's in about 45 years.
45 years?
Yeah, I haven't had
Wow.
McDonald's in
Good
about
on
45 years, so. Anyway, meanwhile, so you got that going on in Moscow where they want McDonald's, but Lithuania wants its country back. Anybody from Lithuania here? No Lithuanians. My wife's family came from Lithuania. Anyway, they lost their country in 1940. It's March 11th, and Lithuania declared that it was an independent nation, the first of the Soviet republics to do so. It had, however, overestimated Gorbachev's intentions. The Soviet Union was ready to allow communist governments and its satellites fall to democratic movements, but this did not apply to the republics of the Soviet Union. Soviet government responded harshly to Lithuanian Declaration of Independence and issued an ultimatum. Renounce independence or face the consequences. On March 17th, the Lithuanians gave their answer rejecting the Soviet demands and asking that democratic nations grant them diplomatic recognition. The Soviets will try to crush the movement. But Lithuania wants independence. This guy took Lithuania in 1940. His name, Joseph Stalin. It was annexed by Stalin in 1940. Lithuania was the first of Soviet republics to declare independence. Slovenia is next. Slovenian independence referendum. It's December 23rd. An independent referendum was held in Slovenia, part of Yugoslavia. An overwhelming majority opted to leave Yugoslavia. The referendum results were declared 3 days later. Anybody from Yugoslavia? Background from Yugoslavia? No? Okay. On December 26th, the results of the referendum were officially proclaimed by Franz Bukar in the Assembly. 88.5% of the eligible voters, and there were 94.8% of the country that voted, eligible voters, voted in favor of independence, exceeding the threshold. 4% voted against independence, 0.9%, a little under 1%, had cast invalid ballots. 0.1% have returned their ballots unused. Just 6.5% of the electors did not participate in the election. The announcement forced Slovenian authorities to declare the country independent within 6 months. Poland, Lech Walesa becomes the Polish president. Who's from Poland? Somebody said they had Polish background? On December 9th, Lech Walesa was the winner in Poland's first direct presidential election. Meanwhile, there is a London summit back in 1990, and George Bush is there along with Margaret Thatcher and others. NATO leaders discussed the impact of the fall of the Berlin Wall at the summit, outlining proposals for developing cooperation with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the former communist countries. The Cold War belongs to history. Our alliance is moving from confrontation to cooperation, said the NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner in his opening comments. Well, there's also the Nobel Peace Prize. It was given to Gorbachev. It's November 15th. A Norwegian-based panel awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, for his efforts to help bring the Cold War to a peaceful end. The committee cited his leading role in the peace process, which today characterizes important parts of the international community. Well, there are still problems in Yemen today. Yemen's problems have never been solved. There are still problems there. But at least in 1990, there was a reunification. It's May 22nd, the Yemen Arab Republic and the People Democratic Republic of Yemen announced that they would form a united Republic of Yemen. That's their flag. Looks like a Maybelline box, doesn't it? All you have to do is splash Maybelline right across it. Looks like a Maybelline box. The area that comprises Yemen today is traditionally, since the 19th century, been divided along a north and south divide. What was once North Yemen was part of the former Ottoman Empire during the 19th and early 20th centuries. What used to be South Yemen fell under British influence starting in 1839 when the British captured the port of Aden. South Yemen lived under British rule until 1967. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, North Yemen became an independent republic, while South Yemen continued under the British until the British withdrew in 1967. The People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which existed in the South from 1967 to 1990, was a Marxist-Leninist one-party state. While elections were held frequently, the Yemeni Socialist Party was the only ruling party and exercised near total authority over both the legislative and administrative systems. This is South Yemen in 1962. It's funny because I remember a kid coming from Yemen to my school around 1963. Didn't know any of the circumstances. I now know the circumstances because some Jewish Yemeni citizens did flee and end up in New York City.
Where was your school?
In Lower Manhattan. The Yemeni Arab Republic, commonly known as North Yemen or Yemen, existed from 1962 to 1990. On September 26, 1962, revolutionaries inspired by the Arab nationalist ideology of the United Arab Republic, which was Egypt and Syria, the Egyptian president who ran the UAR, Nasser, disposed of the newly crowned King Mohammed al-Badr, took control of Sana'a and established the Yemen Arab Republic. There is Nasser in 1962. Why is this guy smiling? He lost the Suez Canal crisis, didn't he? In 1956-57. Coup d'etat marked the beginning of the North Yemen civil war that pitted RAY troops assisted by the United Arab Republic, Egypt, against Badr's royal forces supported by Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and that has not changed over the years. Conflict continued periodically until 1967 when Egyptian troops were withdrawn to join the conflict of the Six-Day War. You remember that war? Israel cleaned up after 6 days. Egypt was a big loser. By 1968, following a final royalist siege of Sana'a, most of the opposing leaders reached a reconciliation. Saudi Arabia recognized the republic in 1970. So here's the timeline. 1969, a communist coup renames the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, reoriented toward the Soviet bloc. 1970, Republican forces triumph in the North Yemen Civil War. 1972, border clashes between the two Yemens, ceasefire brokered by the Arab League. This is Ali Abdul Salah. He becomes the president of North Yemen in 1978. New fighting in 1979 between the two Yemens. On March 20th, the leaders of North and South Yemen in 1979 call a bilateral ceasefire. They meet in Kuwait for a reconciliation summit at the insistence of Iraq. There's all kind of inner fighting among the Middle East countries. In May 1988, the North and South government came to an understanding that considerably reduced tensions. They agreed to renewed discussions concerning unification to establish a joint oil exploration area along their undefined border, to demilitarize the border, and to allow Yemenis unrestricted passage on the basis of a national identification card. There would be a new Yemen in 1990. The unification takes place May 22nd. It would be a 30-month process. The first stamp that came out bearing the inscription Yemeni Republic was issued in October. Government ministries proceeded to merge. Both currencies remained valid until June 11, 1996. Well, Nelson Mandela is released from prison. He's finally out after decades. He's released unconditionally on February 11th after spending 27 years in prison. The release happened after the apartheid government had previously offered conditional freedom in 1985. That offer was turned down. As Mandela, as a very young man. On June 12, 1964, Nelson Mandela received a life sentence for committing sabotage against South Africa's apartheid government, but did avoid a possible death sentence. And here he is. He is released from a South Africa prison. And people didn't know what he looked like. He'd been in prison so long and there were no pictures of him. And people didn't really know what Nelson Mandela looked like when he was released. He was 71 years old. It's February 11th. He walked out of South Africa's Victor Verster prison near Cape Town after 27 years, holding hands with his wife, Winnie. The world watched the occasion on television. It was a global event. Because of Mandela's decades-long confinement, few people knew what he looked like. Nobody had really seen a recent picture. Read My Lips, No New Taxes. Remember that? Read My Lips, written by Peggy Noonan. Read My Lips, No New Taxes. Oops. Read My Lips, No New Taxes was a phrase spoken by American presidential candidate George H.W. Bush at the 1988 Republican National Convention as he accepted the nomination on August 18th. Written by Peggy Noonan, who somehow is still around as a columnist, writing all kind of stuff that never comes true. But most columnists write all kind of stuff that never comes true. As you know, I've written op-ed pieces. I've been on TV as a pundit. So if you're getting 250, getting 1 in 4 correct, you're doing pretty well. Most people never get 1 in 4 of their opinions correct. The line was the most prominent soundbite from the speech. The pledge didn't last long. Once in office, Bush found it challenging to keep his promise. The Bush campaign's figures had been based on the assumption that the high rates of economic growth in the late 1980s would continue throughout his time in office. Instead, there was a recession. The president accepted several tax increases, most notably an increase in the top personal tax rate to 31% from 28%. And Bush has to deal with Congress. He reached a deal with congressional lawmakers on the Americans with Disability Act to outlaw discrimination against the disabled in employment and public accommodations. Business lobbies such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Businesses warned that it would cause economic disaster to help out people with disabilities. Bush also reached in a congressional agreement on amendments to the Clean Air Act that would tame the pollution-driven threat of acid rain. Meanwhile, in England, Ronald Reagan's #1 ally in the world is chased from office, the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher. Now, she regained prominence in England because of the Falkland Wars. She was on her way out in the early 1980s because economically Britain was a mess. On November 28th, Margaret Thatcher resigned as the Prime Minister of England. Earlier that month, she failed to receive a majority in the Conservative Party's annual vote for selection of a leader. She withdrew her nomination, and John Major, the Chancellor of the Exchequer since 1989, was chosen as the Conservative leader. On November 22nd, she announced her resignation. 6 days later, Major is the Prime Minister. She had 3 consecutive terms in office, and that marked the longest continuous tenure of a British Prime Minister since 1827. Time to say goodbye, but it's time also to look at her record. She was the first female Prime Minister in British history. In 1979, in March, Prime Minister James Callaghan was defeated by a no-confidence vote. May 3rd, a general election gave Thatcher's Conservatives a 44-seat majority in Parliament. Sworn in the next day, Prime Minister Thatcher immediately set about dismantling socialism in Britain. She privatized numerous industries, cut back government expenditures, and gradually reduced the rights of trade unions. And like I said, her #1 ally was Ronald Reagan globally. Well, you know, you could be the mayor of a town, get arrested, and then get reelected later on. Marion Barry was arrested. Apparently, he had a little drug habit. January 18th, at the end of a joint sting operation FBI agents in the District of Columbia Police, the mayor, Marion Barry, is arrested and charged with drug possession, the use of crack, a crystalline form of cocaine. At the Vista International Hotel in downtown Washington, he was caught smoking the substance on camera with Rashida Moore, a woman who agreed to set up Barry in exchange for a reduced sentence in an earlier drug conviction. This is Boston. Influential museum, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. It's March 18th. It is the early morning hours after St. Patrick's Day in 1990. Two men dressed as cops talked their way into the Venetian-style building filled with priceless paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and decorative arts. After announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen," see how nice they were? "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." They were proper, weren't they, for a museum? Like, they didn't come in here and say, "Here's a robbery!" He said, "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." Thieves tied up the museum's 2 security guards, spent 81 minutes cutting out paintings, including works by Rembrandt, Degas, and Manet, out of their frames without ever tripping an alarm. They got away with 13 pieces valued at about $200 million. It's my father-in-law. That's Mike Tyson. Here's a story behind that picture. My father-in-law used to come to all these boxing things, and he loved hanging around these old pugs. Unbeknownst to me, he took pictures, and finally I knew he was taking pictures, and he wanted a picture of Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson kept saying, "No, no, 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 no." Don King, the promoter, remember Don King? He's still alive, Don King. Don King says, "You respect this man. He's done a lot." My father-in-law was a freeloader. "You respect this man. He does a lot. You better take a picture with him." Don King was his promoter. Father-in-law was a freeloader, but he got this picture with Mike Tyson, complete with a Navy cap. James Buster Douglas was a 42-1 underdog in this fight with Mike Tyson on February 11th, in his bid to become boxing's undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The fight lasted longer than most expected, though it almost ended when Tyson knocked Douglas down with an explosive right hook in the 8th round. But down goes Tyson. In the 10th round, Douglas connected on a barrage of punches that sent Tyson to the canvas. Douglas shocked the world and was boxing's undisputed heavyweight champion. Anybody been to the Leaning Tower of Pisa? When they built it, it started to sink. It's been sinking for centuries, centuries, centuries. And there it is, leaning over, hence called the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's January in Italy. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is closed to visitors for the first time due to fears over safety and stability of the building. Engineers worked on restructuring and stabilizing the building by taking some of the weight out of the tower and straightening out about 18 inches. They couldn't straighten it out. And first of all, it shouldn't have been built. The ground that they built in was terrible ground. But if you straighten out the Leaning Tower of Pisa, who's going to go see the Leaning Tower of Pisa? The Leaning Tower of Pisa had originally been constructed over a span of about 200 years, from the 1170s and the 1370s. And the tilt began to form almost immediately, caused by the building of poor foundation on too soft of soil. But it's been there. It's been there for more than 600 years. The Hubble Space Telescope, that goes up that year. And there is a problem with the telescope. It was launched into low Earth orbit on April 24th. Remains in operation. Not the first space telescope, but it's one of the largest and most versatile. Within weeks of the launch, the return images indicated a serious problem with the optic system. Although the images appeared to be sharper than those of the ground-based telescopes, Hubble failed to achieve a final sharp focus, and the best image quality was obtained by a drastically lower than expected, it was drastically lower than expected. They didn't send anybody up there. They just fixed it on the ground. They just redid the mirrors slightly. I've fallen and I can't get up. My friend Jim Williams claimed he came up with that message. Don't you remember those commercials? I've fallen and I can't get up. Remember? 1989, Lifecall began running commercials that contained a scene wherein an elderly woman, identified by a dispatcher as Mrs. Felcher, used the medical alert pendant after having fallen in the bathroom. After falling, she speaks the phrase, "I've fallen and I can't get up," which Jim Williams said was his grandmother. He claims he came up with the line. After which the dispatcher informs her that he is sending help. In the new year, the Phoenix New Times reported from coast to coast, playground to barroom, and enfeebled whine rings out across the land, all together, "I've fallen and I can't get up." The catchphrase appeared on t-shirts, novelty records, stand-up comedy. Life Call would trademark the phrase. Okay, there was a baseball lockout in 1990. I don't need a script for this because I'm going to tell you about it. That's the commissioner, Fay Vincent, and that is the guy, Bud Selig, who was the owner of the Milwaukee Brewers, who accused me of being the shadow, Lamont Cranston. I was the shadow. Well, here was the problem. See, it was late February. It was a Friday in February around this time, and you're not supposed to make news late Friday because the newspapers on Saturday were real thin. So there's one of these news conferences, and I had gone to, remember the place called Sign of the Dove? It was a restaurant on the Upper East Side. So I went there for a boxing news conference back in January of 1990. And I said to my wife, I said, take off from work. We're going to Sign of the Dove.
What street was it on?
Yeah, I think it was like 63rd Street,
Right.
somewhere around there.
Between
Anyway,
Madison and Park.
yeah. So anyway, I said to my wife, take off from work today. She said, why? I said, we're going to Sign of the Dove. I said, I owe you a good lunch. She said, are you paying for it? I said, I'm not paying for it. You're my guest. Okay. So she's there, and I'm doing my work with it, whatever the boxing people are there. And she's sitting and she's talking to this guy who was a television salesman. And his territory was the Midwest. And he was doing spot sales, which are the way to describe selling one-time commercials during baseball games. And he told her that he wasn't selling any scattered spots until April 15th. And then she introduces me to him. And he tells me, he says, well, we've been told don't bother because there's not going to be any games. So it's late February. And I'm sitting there, we're at the Sheraton on 7th Avenue and 55th Street. And all these guys are asking him the same old questions. And Selig's going like that. This guy says, Lamont Cranston, do you have any questions? I said, yes, I know what evil lurks in your heart. He said, what? I said, well, I've been told that you've told television salespeople don't sell any spots until April 15th. That this is what is going to happen. You're going to lock the players out. You're going to come back 3 weeks with spring training, and then you're going to start the season around April 15th, and then my guy could start selling spots on television. So I know this is scripted. You can see the veins coming out. You can see the red veins popping out. He's upset. He's really upset. Well, the Major League Baseball owners did script the Major League Baseball lockout. I was correct. I was absolutely 100% correct, and I'm proud of that scoop. I've had a bunch of scoops in my career. John Lindsay running for Senate, the end of the National Football League players' strike in 1982. This one was my third, and I was very, very proud of it. And other people came up to me and said, hey, tell me how you do this. How do you get a scoop? I said, you gotta get lucky. You gotta speak to the right guy, which my wife was doing, and for all I know, she was flirting with him. But I gave you the story. Beginning in February, the lockout lasted 32 days, virtually wiping out spring training, moving opening day back to April 9th and extending the season 3 days to accommodate the normal 162-game schedule. The owners established the timeline. I knew the timeline. Everybody else asked me, how did you know the timeline? And I went public finally when Bud Selig retired about 10 years ago. I finally went public saying this is what happened and all that, because it was 20 years afterwards. In February, this reporter, this reporter caught Bud Selig in a lie. Ken Griffey Jr. and Ken Griffey Sr. were both with the Seattle Mariners in 1990, and they hit back-to-back home runs. It's August 31st. Ken Griffey Sr. and Ken Griffey Jr. became the first father-son team to ever play together in the major leagues. A few weeks later, on September 14th, they homered back-to-back against the California Angels pitcher Kirk McCaskill. First time in Major League Baseball history that happened. The Simpsons. They become a hit in 1990. Debuted on December 17, 1989. Exploded in popularity after the new year. Despite its popularity, the show had one major critic. The First Lady, Barbara Bush, criticized The Simpsons as the dumbest thing I've ever seen. As part of a show, the mother character, Marge, wrote a letter to Barbara Bush, politely telling her not to be so judgmental, and that her family tried their best. And you know what? They got an apology. Barbara Bush later apologized for her loose tongue. Milli Vanilli. Well, they fooled people. Milli Vanilli, their rise and fall were swift. They were from Germany. Fabrice Morvan and Rob Pidillas shot up the charts in the late 1980s with hits like Girl, You Know It's True, and Blaming on the Rain. But in November 1990, it was revealed that the two stars were not the vocalists on any of the songs. They ad-libbed when they were live. Fab and Rob were scapegoats who took the fall from everyone. The public outrage was aimed at them, not the producer, manager, or the record label. They returned their Grammy. Fab and Rob were ruined. There were others who never sung on tunes that the record companies put out. They were never caught. The big movie, one of the big movies, was Home Alone. It premiered in Chicago on November 10th. The film starred Macaulay Culkin, Joe Pesci, Daniel Stern, John Hurd, and Catherine O'Hara. Culkin plays Kevin McAllister, a boy who defends his suburban Chicago home from home invasion by a pair of robbers after his family accidentally leaves him behind on their Christmas vacation to Paris. Let me ask you, how many had teenagers back in 1990?
1990?
Yeah, 1990. Anybody have teenagers in 1990?
No building.
No, because
Older.
yeah, if you did, you took them to see this movie. Home Alone was the number one film at the box office for 12 straight weeks from its release of November 19th through the 18th through the weekend of February 1st through 3rd, 1991. Well, the legacy from 1990 as we wrap it up. United Nations deadline for withdrawal, Iraq out of Kuwait, passed on January 15th with no action, so coalition forces began a 5-week bombardment of the Iraqi command and control targets from air and sea. Coalition forces swiftly drove Iraq from Kuwait, advancing into Iraq, reaching a ceasefire within 100 hours, which left Saddam Hussein in power. While coalition casualties were in the hundreds, Iraqi losses numbered in the tens of thousands. On December 25th, 1991, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the final time over the Kremlin, replaced by the Russian tricolor. Earlier in the day, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned his post as president of the Soviet Union, leaving Boris Yeltsin as the president of the newly independent Russian state. The reunification made Germany a great power in the world again. Nelson Mandela, after his prison release, he became the head of the anti-apartheid movement, helped negotiate its end. In 1994, he became the first black president of South Africa after being elected in the first multiracial elections. On June 25th, 1991, the basic constitutional charter on independence and sovereignty of the Republic of Slovenia was passed. Independence declared the next day. Oh, this guy was in Yemen, Osama bin Laden. After the civil war broke out in 1994, the South Yemen movement, which called for the return of the independent southern state, in 2015, this time as a pawn in the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Yemen again was engulfed in a civil war which continues to this day. Yemen has long been a hotbed for al-Qaeda activity. On October 12, 2000, an explosive-laden skiff rammed into the USS Cole, a U.S. warship docked off the Aden port, killing 17 Marines. The mastermind behind that attack was Arami al-Sarhiri, who was Osama bin Laden's head of operation in the Gulf. Mike Tyson today. Buster Douglas was knocked out by Evander Holyfield in the third round of his championship defense on October 25th, 1990, retired after the fight. Mike Tyson ended up in jail in Indianapolis, Indiana, after a jury found him guilty of raping Desiree Washington in 1991. He served 3 years, returned to boxing, won 2 more titles, became kind of a celebrity. He earned more than $300 million, but filed for bankruptcy in 2003. The Leaning Tower of Pisa reopened in 2001. Life Call went out of business in 1999. The catchphrase, "I've fallen, I can't get up," didn't save them. In September 1991, Washington Mayor Marion Barry was sentenced to 6 months in prison for possession of crack cocaine. After serving his sentence, he re-entered politics. He was elected to the Washington City Council before once again winning the mayoral election in 1994 for an unprecedented fourth term. The Simpsons, well, they're still around. The Griffeys remain the only father and son who have hit back-to-back home runs in Major League history. The Simpsons is the largest running scripted television show in American history. The Gardner Museum art heist remains unsolved. The museum is offering $10 million as a reward to find the paintings. And there have been 6 Home Alone movies. The Home Alone brand is worth billions of dollars. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk. I'm all talked out. Yeah, go ahead.
A little footnote.